we're looking at this question about how Cairo in the 1800s transformed to look more like an international city similar to London and Paris. And this is a map of Cairo, and you'll see that one of the things that they did in the 1800s was they began to build these large highways, which was useful for transporting large amounts of industrial goods and machinery for the new Egyptian economy of the 1800s, oriented around new industries, such as the new tobacco industry, where Egypt produced and exported cigarettes and got the tobacco from the new agricultural districts that were using some modern machinery brought in by the Egyptian Greeks. These were Greeks from the Ottoman Empire, from the Greek islands, who came to Egypt and began to modernize some of the agricultural and urban tobacco and cigarette production. And there were other industries. So Egypt, 1800s, Industrial Revolution, new districts that were oriented around factories and all the new exports that the Egyptians wanted to build their economy around. And one of the ways to do this was to build larger roads and highways that would be able to transport machinery and industrial goods and whatnot. One of the other reasons why they were building these new roads and new districts was that they believed having too much of the city made up of, they thought it was bad if too much of the city was made up of these gated, semi-gated communities like you would see in Fez. They thought that people should be living in these residential districts along larger roads, and it would, quote, open up the city in a way that they believed, the government in the 1800s believed that it was good for public health and it was good for socializing in a new way. In the old cities, Old Cairo, Old Fez, you see that the design of the city was oriented around large residential districts. People in those residential districts would get to know one another in their streets and neighborhoods, and those neighborhoods would open up into the square, Midan, built around a kind of giant mosque or a giant church or a giant synagogue. And then those districts and the squares would lead to a larger marketplace, and there were like a souk, and there would be multiple marketplaces. And then those marketplaces could lead to or open out onto a square associated with maybe a central city mosque or a giant, in Italy, they have some cities like this, in Venice, a giant city church. Like in Venice, you had the St. Mark's Cathedral. And so that was kind of the urban plan of the old cities. Venice in Italy was a bit like that, but also in the Middle East and North Africa, you'd have much of the city was residential districts, and then people would connect with one another in these larger marketplaces, the souk, and then you'd have these giant mosques and churches and the square around it, and there might be like a palace. And again, Venice, you have the St. Mark's Cathedral, St. Mark's Square, and then there's the palace of the ruler, the duke, and there's the senate there. And all that is on the edge of the city. So the newer cities were supposed to be built around, kind of like Paris and London, more opened up, less residential districts, more giant roads with factories around the big roads, and then you'd have these more and more government buildings because the government was expanding its administration. And so who in Cairo was responsible for this major urban planning revolution? It was this guy named Ali Mubarak, who came from a rural background in Egypt. And in the 1860s, it says here on page 63, on the top here, he was an accomplished, what book is this? This is the Colonizing Egypt by Timothy Mitchell. He's not saying that the British and the French colonized Egypt. He's saying that the Egyptian administrators adopted some of the political trends found in the British Empire and the French Empire, and they imported these ideas to Egypt. So in the winter of 1867, Ali Mubarak, an accomplished Egyptian administrator, teacher, and engineer, traveled to Paris on financial business for the Egyptian government. And he visited the Exposition Universelle, which is a kind of an international fair, international festival conference. He stayed several weeks, as he later described in some detail, so he wrote about it, studying the new Parisian systems of education. Says here he examined the buildings, the books, the curricula of the new schools. So he was responsible for bringing to the palace in Cairo, which still exists, the old palace of the Muhammad Ali dynasty, which was turned into a kind of museum after the 1950s. He brought to the palace these new ideas, and he built some offices. And it says here, on his return to Egypt, he was appointed Minister of Schools and Minister of Public Works. And over the following decade, he laid out and began building the modern city of Cairo, the modern system of education. So if you go to Cairo, you can see that there's the old districts, Old Cairo, and then those old districts, when you kind of step out of them, they blend into the newer districts, and the newer districts are in like downtown West al Balad, and there's Masri Gedida, New Cairo, there's Medinat Nasr, there's Maadi, there is what's that other one? I forgot. There's one place. I forgot. A lot of Europeans used to live there in the 1900s. So there's all the Aguza, and those are the newer districts. And on those streets there are factories and government buildings and hospitals. So they wanted to kind of, so to speak, quote, open up the city, so that things were a bit more kind of sprawling and spread out, and things would not be so clustered together as you would see in Old Cairo or Old Fez. And so on page 66, it says here, after the Bureau of Public Works, so he went to the palace, established these offices there, and planned out the new public school system. Everybody would go to the same style of school, learn Arabic if they were Italians and Greeks, and then he also planned out this urban planning administrative office. It says here, there followed the greatest period of construction and demolition in the city since the growth of Mamluk Cairo in the 1300s. A new structure was laid out between the north and western edges of the existing city, and its new gateway from Alexandria and Europe. So really Alexandria. The railway station was planned out. Then it says in the lower line, he himself is writing, the transformation of the city of Cairo from an aesthetic point of view, as it was described by one of those responsible, required the filling in and leveling of the wasteland around the city, the opening up. That was an important thing for them, opening up of main streets and new arteries, meaning like smaller streets. The creation of squares and midan, open places. They had squares in the old cities of Cairo, Fez, and whatnot. They just kind of wanted more of them. The planting of trees, the surfacing of roads, the construction of drains, regular cleaning and watering. And it says here, this spatial ordering in turn required the removal of certain human agglomerations from the interior. So they did not want these clusters of tightly knit residential districts like you'd see in Old Cairo and Old Fez. They wanted wider streets and residential districts and factories and government buildings and hospitals lining those larger streets together with cafes and whatnot. Obviously, Old Cairo, Old Fez, Old Baghdad, they had hospitals. They even had cafes in the old cities in the 1500s, coffee shops and whatnot. They just did not want all of this to look so much like a gated community, gated, G-A-T-E. They wanted it to be more kind of sprawling. And by the 1900s, these streets and roads were big enough to be able to move not only machinery for agriculture through the city, but also to be able to transport tanks, military equipment. So it says here, from Khedive, that's an English word, Khedive Ismail. In Arabic it's Khediwi, in Turkish it's Hudav. It's kind of like a sultan. From Khedive Ismail's new palace of Abdin, close to this other palace, the boulevard Muhammad Ali was plowed diagonally through the old city, and it's in its path stood almost 400 large houses, 300 smaller ones, and a great number of mosques, mills, bakeries, and bathhouses. They were all destroyed, and the new road was built in there. And they have a little image of this here. So these are the new highways that become part of modern Cairo. And the idea there was that this would make Cairo look more like London and Paris. It was kind of better designed for factories, industrialization, for factory workers to socialize in coffee shops, to be able to work in hospitals and the public school system. But and so this was supposed to kind of move away from this older style of urban planning, which Europeans thought was chaotic, fawda. But the older styles of urban planning in Cairo and Fez, you can actually see this today in some of the newest districts of places like Brooklyn and New York City. People think that those older styles of urban planning, the good thing about it was that the communities were more tightly knit. Neighbors could kind of babysit each other's children. You'd get like kind of, you wouldn't have to pay for daycare because grandmothers in the neighborhood would be taking care of other families' kids. So it was a bit more of a kind of tight knit community. So you do have today in some of the wealthiest districts around the world, you have gated communities, GATED communities, and people spend a lot of money to live there. But the old cities like Old Fez, Old Cairo, they were kind of like naturally gated communities. If you walk through Fez, you can see that the neighbors know each other, they can take care of each other's children. But in the 1800s, Egyptian administrators, in agreement with Paris and London administrators, thought that these kinds of gated residential communities of the old centuries, they were not good for public health. They did not allow for people to be socialized in the public school system in the best way, and that people should be able to people should be, can become kind of modern citizens through these new styles of urban planning by going to public schools, working in these government factories, maybe joining the military, working in government administration, and and there were jobs in government administration because in the 18 and 1900s, the size of the bureaucracy or the idara administration of the government was rapidly growing, and you had more and more people working in more and more offices. And again, you can see some of this reversing today. In places like Argentina and the United States, the newest governments are saying that the government administration and bureaucracy has become so big with so many departments or ministries that it's a waste of taxpayer money, and it's inefficient. And even now, right at the moment in the United States, the government is discussing closing some of these departments and ministries, reducing the staff. And this is considered part of a kind of politically libertarian perspective that believes that there should be less government management and control of individual citizens. Some of those people look back at the old centuries of Europe and the Middle East and North Africa with some nostalgia because they believe that those societies functioned better socially when there was less government management and control of the individuals. Other people disagree and think that this is good, how in the 1800s the government played a key role in creating new modern citizens that were socialized in these new public schools and whatnot. So very interesting, and that's coming out of page 65 and 66. They call them here, you can see Bureau of Public Works. This is or the Diwan al-Awqaf. This would be today also called a Department of Endowments or Department of Public Works or a Ministry of Public Works. And if you go to Cairo in Midan al-Tahrir, you can see some of those government buildings, and those government buildings all around the city. And again, in Cairo, the newer districts are called there's West al-Balad, and then there's the Medina Nasr, Masr al-Gadida, also called Heliopolis. And then in the last 10, 15 years in Cairo, you have this new Cairo city, which is different from Masr al-Gadida. Very interesting. And again, that little interesting, notable fact that many people today have some nostalgia for these older centuries, old tight-knit communities. And so you do have today very expensive gated communities like in Brooklyn that are trying to bring back some of that old social dimension of a kind of community-oriented lifestyle.